There's no denying that life in a medieval castle was a luxurious one. Just imagine waking up every morning knowing that you could have your very own portrait, painted by one of the greatest artists of the time, strolling through sprawling gardens designed by the most renowned landscape architects of the day, and wining and dining your way through endless feasts. But this fantasy can quickly turn into a nightmare when you realize that it's only 8 a.m. and you still have to get ready for the day ahead. See, being a noble in medieval Europe came with certain perks. If you were a woman, though, those perks sometimes included having to deal with the royal mistress. Now, whether you liked it or not, the king's mistress had a lot of power. Sometimes her influence over the king was enough to make her rival the queen. So today, let's take a look at some of the most powerful royal mistresses in history. Eleanor of Aquitaine, Duchess of a kind, born in 1122. Eleanor of Aquitaine was a true child of the time. She was married off at age 14 to King Louis VII of France. The marriage produced children, but was ultimately annulled 8 years later because, well, the bride was not exactly thrilled about the idea of spending the rest of her life with her cousin. The happy couple were eventually set to wed again, this time to King Henry II of England. This union expanded the royal dynasty while also cementing the region's power. Not that Eleanor had any say in the matter. See, she was a pawn used by the royal families to expand their territories, wealth, and power. And while she eventually did come to accept Henry, he had a notorious temper and once struck her so hard he wounded her eye. After she gave birth to their son, Thomas, Eleanor spent a good amount of time apart from Henry. During this separation, she conspired with her sons to rebel against Henry, which didn't end too well for her. In her twilight years, she became a nun, perhaps hoping that her next life would be a bit more peaceful than her last. Isabella of France. It should come as no surprise that a list of royal mistresses would not be complete without the infamous Isabella of France, better known as the She-Wolf of France. Isabella was the younger sister of King Charles VI. So when her older brother went to war, she was left behind to watch over the kingdom. A responsibility she took very seriously. Her sense of duty led her to reject multiple offers of marriage from other nobles, until an English lord named Roger de Morio came along. He caught Isabella's eye, and she agreed to marry him despite his status as a commoner. Now, this didn't sit well with the royal court, who were furious that their lady had chosen a pauper. But they couldn't stop the wedding. Eventually, word of Isabella's marriage reached the ears of the English king, Edward I, who found himself irresistibly drawn to the French queen. When Edward invaded France, hoping to win back his ancestral lands, he met up with Isabella, who willingly threw herself into the arms of her suitor. Together, they plotted to oust Charles VI from the throne and replace him with Edward Peer. And for a time, things seemed to be going their way. But eventually, Charles VI regrouped and captured Isabella, along with her lover. Both were imprisoned, and rumors swirled that Isabella had been forced to drink poison after it was discovered that she was carrying Edward as child. But how exactly she died remains a mystery. The lady of the castle, as we all know, Kings tend to have a thing for beautiful women. And when you live in a castle, far from civilization and prying eyes, it can be easy to develop an attachment to said women. In fact, if you're a famous medieval monarch, it's practically a rite of passage to keep a mistress, or to around. Take, for instance, King Edward I's son, King Edward II. During his reign, he appointed Piers Gaveston as Constable of England and the keeper of the royal household. And to say that this appointment was unpopular would be a bit of an understatement. You see, Gaveston was nothing more than a lowly servant when he first entered the royal court. But Edward II kept him close anyway. Rumors quickly spread that the king was giving Gaveston lavish gifts and promotions just because he wanted to. And there was even speculation that Edward II had plans to wed his friend. Of course, these accusations were false. But it was around this time that the king began seeing one of Gaveston's ladies-in-waiting, the Marchioness of Winchester. Some sources claim that Edward II was so infatuated with the woman that he paid her exorbitant amounts of money to spend time with her, much to the chagrin of his wife, Queen Margaret. Things became even more complicated when Edward II kicked Gaveston out of the country. Not long after, the king's new favorite became the Marchioness of Winchester, and she bore him 3 children. Talk about complicated. Mistress and muse. The royal court wasn't the only place where mistresses could wield considerable power. For example, in Italy during the Renaissance, it was fashionable for wealthy men to maintain a mistress alongside their legitimate wife. Usually, these women weren't accepted by society, and they lived separately from the men who bore them. But this wasn't always the case. Take the mistress of artist Raphael, for instance. The young painter was born in 1483 and rose to prominence in the early 16th century. Although he died at the age of 37, Raphael produced a staggering amount of work and is considered to be one of the greatest painters of the High Renaissance. One of his muses was a woman named Maddalena Doni. In 1509, he painted one of his most famous works, The School of Athens, which was commissioned by Pope Julius II. The massive fresco contained several portraits of prominent thinkers and scientists, but one face stood out to art historians in particular. A strikingly beautiful woman who looked remarkably like Magdalena. Many believe that she was the model for Raphael's portrayal of Plato in the painting, which makes sense, considering that he had recently completed another portrait of her dressed as the goddess Minerva. Clearly, Raphael was quite fond of his mistress. There's no word on whether she felt the same way. A noble birth. Once again, it seems that the royal family tree has a funny way of bringing people together. Or maybe it was just a convenient excuse for an extramarital affair. In this case, though, there is no denying that the connection between King James V of Scotland and his mistress was a powerful one. When James came to power in 1424, he was only 17 years old. So his counselors essentially ran the country while he focused on finding a suitable bride. His choice fell on Princess Joan of England. Unfortunately, his father-in-law wasn't keen on the union, and the wedding never took place. So, James started seeing a noble woman named Isabella of the House of Stuart. Despite her noble roots, Isabella was forced to hide her relationship with the king, and she lived in a separate apartment in the palace. Naturally, rumors soon began to circulate about the nature of their relationship. Then, in 1428, Isabella gave birth to a son. To cover up the scandal, James claimed that Isabella's husband, Sir John Stuart, was actually her lover, not him. As a result, John was arrested and executed. All the while, Isabella and James were living openly together, although they were never wed. The heart of the king. If you ever find yourself in a royal arranged marriage, it might help to remember one important tip. Do you want to cheat on your spouse, unless you want to start a war? Ask King Charles VIII of Norway. Back in the 13th century, Charles was betrothed to an English princess named Margaret. The wedding was part of an alliance between the two countries. But sadly, the newlyweds weren't exactly compatible. As a result, Charles spent a great deal of his time apart from Margaret, and instead hanging out with his mistress, a woman named Kristen, who lived in a mansion across from the palace. Rumor had it that the king had fallen deeply in love with his mistress, and he lavished her with expensive gifts. Then, to make matters worse, Kristen bore the king a son, which made Margaret even more unhappy. She began plotting revenge and enlisted the help of her brother, King Eric VI. Together, they hatched a plan to invade Norway. They managed to take over the kingdom, dethrone Charles VIII, and imprison him in his own palace. From there, they brought Kristen and her son to England, where she was publicly shamed and sent away with a pension. As for Charles VIII, he spent the rest of his days in captivity, dreaming of his one true love, Kristen. 4 more royal scandals. Check out Worst Royal Weddings in History or watch Worst Kept Secrets in History for more of the juiciest tales. Who was Nell Gwyn? And why is she remembered as the only royal mistress to have been crowned the people's mistress? Pie, everyone. Pie, everyone. Welcome to this house. Today we are exploring the life of an actress who became the people's mistress. Make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss an exciting episode. In 1650, a young woman named Elizabeth Guild arrived in London with dreams of becoming an actress. She began performing in plays by William Wycherley and was soon noticed for her comedic timing and vivacious personality. In addition to her acting talent, Nellie, as she was now known, had another attribute that made her stand out. She was exceptionally beautiful, with long flowing red hair, rosy cheeks and lips, and a stunning figure. It was unlong before playwrights were writing roles specifically for her, and she was making quite a name for herself. Her path to notoriety, however, would take a turn when she met the man who would become King Charles II. Charles II had come to power in troubled times, following the English Civil War. The monarchy was at a low point, and England was still recovering from the turmoil. However, this did not stop Charles from enjoying his one true passion, having affairs with young actresses. He had met several during his travels incognito around the country, and it was rumored that he kept a stable of mistresses at court. One such mistress was Louise de la Vallière, whom he had met in 1660, after the restoration of the monarchy. Their relationship lasted until 1667, when she gave birth to their son, the illegitimate Charles Beauclerk, later the Duke of St. Albans, with her affair over La Vallière. was sent away with a generous allowance and a title. Around this time, Charles was experiencing some trouble with his wife, the Portuguese Infanta Catherine Braganza. While the two had initially had a good relationship, stints had been rocky for some time, and rumors of infidelity on both sides abounded. When Catherine found out about Charles's affair with Nell Gwyn Pye, however, she was furious and refused to accept Nell as one of the Queen's men. Catherine's disapproval, along with the scandal it caused at court, did little to deter Charles, who had already fallen head over heels for Nell. By 1668, Nell was expecting Charles's child and determined to leave her mark on the world. She set about securing a noble title for herself. There was only one problem. However, her plans required her to marry a nobleman, which would make her a lady and thus ineligible to be a royal mistress. Unwilling to give up on either her acting career or her romance, with the king concocted a plan. She agreed to marry the Earl of Castlemaine, a long-time secret suitor, who was also one of Charles's closest friends. Not only would this unite them in marriage, but it would also ensure that Nell would be accepted by the turn, since Castlemaine was a prominent member of the nobility. With that, Nell married the Earl in secret and gave birth to her son, Charles Beauclerk, in November of 1669. Although Charles II never acknowledged the marriage, he did recognize his son and legitimized him as Prince of England. This may have been a way for the king to secure a legitimate heir, since he and the Queen had been unable to produce one. Unfortunately, the young prince died at age, leaving Charles and Nell without a way to secure their relationship through a legitimate child. But this didn't stop the king from showering Nell and her son, the new Earl of Castlemaine, with gifts. And while he still couldn't publicly acknowledge her, he made sure everyone knew she was his favorite. Meanwhile, Nell enjoyed her time in the spotlight and relished in her status as the people's mistress. This nickname came from the fact that, unlike other mistresses who lived in lavish apartments provided by the king, Nell chose to remain in her own home in Drury Lane, which she shared with her husband and their 2 children. Instead of accepting expensive gifts from the king, she requested and received shares in his plays and in the profits from the lottery for the city of London. The people loved her for this and saw her as more honest and down to earth than the other mistresses. Additionally, Nell was well known for her wit and intelligence. She could hold her own in a conversation with the most learned men, and was even said to have conversed with the philosopher John Locke on the subject of religion. Nell used her sharp mind to her advantage, managing to outmaneuver many of the nobles who tried to take advantage of her situation. For example, when her brother Thomas asked her for money to buy a baronetcy, she refused unless he agreed to allow her to purchase a baronetcy for herself. This ensured that she would always have a seat in the House of Lords and cemented her place in the nobility. Sadly, Nell's story doesn't end with her securing her place in history. In 1677, she began suffering from a mysterious illness that would eventually be diagnosed as uterine cancer. Knowing that she was dying, Nell decided to go on one last tour of the countryside with the acting company. After returning to London, She spent her final months visiting friends and family, including her estranged husband, the Earl of Castlemaine. She reportedly forgave him for his infidelities, and the two reconciled before her death. On February 14th, 1687, Valentine's Day, Nell Gwynn died at her home in London. Despite her humble beginnings, she had managed to carve out a place in history as an actress, a mistress, and a mother. Her legacy lives on in the stories that have been told and retold about her life. So what can we learn from Nell's story? How did she become the people's mistress? We think there are a few key factors that contributed to Nell's rise to fame. First, she was exceptionally talented as an actress, and was able to use this talent to get ahead in a male-dominated industry. She was also beautiful, and knew how to use her beauty to her advantage. Additionally, Nell was intelligent and witty, which helped her to navigate the treacherous waters of 17th century London. Finally, she was relatable to the common people of London, who saw her as honest and down to earth. This was in stark contrast to the other mistresses, who were seen as frivolous and vain. As a result, Nell was beloved by the public and earned the title of the people's mistress. Nell's story is a reminder that anyone can achieve greatness if they set their mind to it. She came from humble beginnings, but she didn't let that stop her from achieving her dream. She was also a trailblazer in a male-dominated industry, and paved the way for future generations of actresses. Additionally, Nell was a savvy businesswoman and knew how to manage her money. Please, she was also charitable and used her wealth to help others. Finally, she was a loving mother and loyal friend. Nell was a true Renaissance woman, and her story is an inspiration to us all. Thank you all for watching. I really hope that you enjoyed this video. Which fact about Nell's life surprised you the most? Did you know that she was an actress before she became the mistress? Let me know down below in the comments section. While you're there, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss an exciting episode. I would also like to say a special thank you to our supporters whose names you can see on the screen right now. If you would like to see your name on the screen and show the world your support for the production, join our membership program today. I'll see you next time. When we think of famous mistresses throughout history, some names may spring to mind, like Valerie Simpson or Marilyn Monroe. But compared to these women, the life and accomplishments of Madame de Pompadour were even more dramatic. Pastoral, his story filled with betrayal, hidden affairs, and shocking scandals that shook 18th century France to its core. Join us as we uncover the secrets of this enigmatic woman and explore how she became the mistress who ruled France. Born Jean Lashinska on November 29th, 1725, Pompadour's origins were humble. Her father was a valet for a Polish countess, and the family scraped by in Paris to help make ends meet. Young Jean took up dancing lessons and became a well-sought-after teacher. It was not long before her talents caught the eye of the nobility, and she began giving private classes to the daughters of France, elite. One of these students was the 14-year-old Mademoiselle de Blois, daughter of the royal treasurer. And it was here that Pompadour met the man who would change her life forever. The Sun King, Louis V. Louis was 23 years older than Pompadour, but sparks flew between the pair when he attended one of her dance classes. He was so taken with her that he asked for private lessons, and soon the pair were meeting in secret. While she was initially reluctant, Pompadour eventually gave in to the king's advances and became his mistress. She bore him 2 children, a boy and a girl, and moved into the palace of Versailles. There, she attracted the attention of another powerful man, the future regent Philippe II, Duke of Orleans. Unlike Louis, though, their relationship was purely platonic, and the Duke's sister, Marie Louise, Queen of Spain, became suspicious of their close relationship. She accused Madame de Pompadour of using her influence over the Sun King to get what she wanted. And when the Queen learned that Pompadour had been meeting with other nobles in private, she ordered her arrested. The charges against Pompadour were shocking, but perhaps not entirely surprising. The young woman had an undeniable charm and intelligence, and she quickly rose through the ranks of the Sun King's mistresses, becoming one of the most powerful women in France. When Louis first started seeing Pompadour, who was still married to Marie-Therese of Austria, the woman he had chosen to be his bride. When he was only 14 years old, the marriage had been a disaster from the start, producing no surviving children and being rocked by a number of the king's infidelities. Despite the fact that Louis had cheated on her repeatedly, Marie-Therese refused to accept Pompadour as a member of the French court, knowing full well that she had been one of the Sun King's mistresses before their marriage. But after Pompadour gave birth to the king's first child, Marie-Therese softened, and the 2 women formed an unlikely friendship. It didn't last long, however, as the queen was deeply affected by the death of her stepson, Louis, and soon fell ill. She passed away a few weeks later in 1764, clearing the way for Pompadour to become the official mistress of the Sun King, while Louis's counselors and ministers urged him to marry one of the many suitable noblewomen who sought his hand. He remained determined to wed Pompadour, but since such a marriage would be scandalous and go against the rules of the Catholic Church, the couple instead chose to wed in secret. A wedding ring was exchanged in 1765, though it's unclear when exactly the ceremony took place. By then, Pompadour had cemented her position as the dominant force in the Sun King's life. Not only did she have his heart, but she also had his ear, often advising him on important matters of state. She appointed her friends and family to positions of power, and even went so far as to choose the king's minister. But Pompadour's influence went far beyond the palace wall, positioned to help write important laws and decrees, earning her the nickname the Minister in the Skirt. Though some criticized her for her lack of decorum, and others claimed that she ran the country like a woman of the people. There's no denying that Pompadour played a significant role in shaping France during her lifetime. But all the while, rumors swirled around her private life. The public knew that she had once been a lowly dancer and suspected that she had used her body to advance her social standing. After bearing the Sun King 2 children, Pompadour had 2 more with her secret lover, the Duke of Orleans. This affair produced another son and a daughter, and Madame de Montespan. One of Louis's former mistresses spread vicious rumors about the Duke to the Sun King, claiming that he had been unfaithful. Jealous of Pompadour's power and status, Montespan's accusations drove a wedge between Louis and the Duke, and the Duke's wife took the secret lover's side, further infuriating the Sun King. When Louis found out that Pompadour was having an affair, he was furious, but surprisingly, he was less angry with her than with the Duke. He banished the Duke from the court and sent him to Spain as ambassador. Meanwhile, Pompadour kept her position as the Sun King's mistress and continued to advise him on important matters. Pompadour's hold on power was challenged once again when the Sun King fell for another one of her dance students, the Marquis de Montespan. For, unlike Pompadour, Montespan was a nobody, and the Sun King lavished upon her the kind of attention he had previously reserved for his mistress. He bought her luxurious gifts, gave her a noble title, and showered her with affection. And while the other mistresses might have plotted to take the Sun King back, Pompadour was above such petty behavior. Instead, she acted graciously towards Montespan, welcoming her into her home and treating her like a friend. She knew that she could never compete with the favors the Sun King bestowed upon the younger woman, so she chose to focus on what she had. This was probably also a good strategy to keep tabs on the Sun King and ensure that no scandal would bring her down. Though the other mistresses might have plotted to take the Sun King back, Pompadour was above such petty behavior. Instead, she acted graciously toward Montespan, welcoming her into her home and treating her like a friend. She knew that she could never compete with the favors the Sun King bestowed upon the younger woman, so she chose to focus on what she had. This was probably also a good strategy to keep tabs on the Sun King and ensure that no scandal would bring her down. Despite her cleverness and ability to navigate the treacherous waters of the French court, Pompadour's health was deteriorating. In 1764, she suffered a miscarriage, and her condition worsened in the following years. She became increasingly reclusive, staying in bed for long periods and avoiding social events. Fearing that her time was running out, Pompadour made plans for her children's future. She arranged for her son with the Sun King to become a cardinal and secured a noble title and pension for her daughter. Sadly, the Sun King did not live long enough to see any of these plans come to fruition. He passed away on May 10th, 1774, leaving the throne to his 5-year-old grandson, Louis XVI. Pompadour was devastated by her lover's death, and she died just 8 months later at the age of 48. She was buried alongside the Sun King in the Basilica of St. Denis, and her legacy lived on through her children and the many paintings and sculptures that immortalized her likeness. Madame de Pompadour was a truly remarkable woman. She defied the odds and rose from humble beginnings to become the mistress of the Sun King and the most powerful woman in France. Her intelligence, charm, and wit made her a force to be reckoned with, and she used her position to shape the future of France. But, despite her accomplishments, she was also a product of her time, and her personal life was mired in scandal and controversy. Nevertheless, her story continues to fascinate us today, and she remains one of the most enigmatic figures in history. Now it's time to hear from you. What did you think of this story? Did you know about Madame de Pompadour before watching this video? If you enjoyed this video, do not forget to hit the thumbs up button below to stay up to date on all our latest videos. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time. When it comes to mistresses, they are remembered for one of two reasons. Either for being so forgettable that we don't even know their names, or for being the crazy ones who drove the queen mad with jealousy. Diane de Poitiers is the exception to both of these rules. A mistress who became so powerful that she was able to shamelessly outshine the queen and walk all over her. She also gave the world some iconic looks that had never been seen before. Today we will be talking about her story, her relationship with Henry II, and how she got to be the most powerful woman in France, at least for a while. Let's get started. Diane de Poitiers was born in 1522 to a family of low-ranking nobility. Her father was the Marquis of Montazia, and her mother was the former mistress of the royal court. So, Diane grew up surrounded by royalty and knew what it took to get ahead in the game. As a teenager, her beauty caught the eye of the royal family when she was only 14 years old. And a few years later, she was chosen to be the companion of Anne de Pisseleu, mistress of Francis I at this point. She was just a pawn used by the real power brokers of the court. Poitiers. But she knew that if she played her cards right, she could end up in the king's good graces. A few years later, Francis I died, and his son, Henry II, took the throne. Unfortunately, Henry's wife, Isabella, of the Spanish royal family, was not a looker. Just take a look at those eyebrows. No wonder Henry was looking elsewhere for his pleasures, and that's where Diane came in. When Diane entered the picture, she was already an experienced mistress, having had a long-term relationship with a duke that bore 2 of her children. But nothing could have prepared her for the kind of relationship she would have with the king. They met when she was 23 and he was 36, and it was love at first sight. Diane quickly became the king's favorite mistress, and he showered her with expansive gifts, including jewelry, clothes, and even a brand new chateau. Diane may have been beautiful, but she was also smart. She knew how to read the room, and she knew that the king was not going to leave his wife for her. So, instead of trying to compete with Isabella, she simply ignored her and played the perfect little mistress, giving the king everything he wanted and never asking for anything in return. Like she knew exactly what buttons to push to win the king's heart, without even trying. Bez wasn't even a secret relationship. They were together all the time, and no one thought twice about it. The king and his mistress made quite the pair, and people would stop and stare whenever they saw them together. They looked like a movie couple, if you ask me, and it must have been quite the sight to see. But it was Diane, a sense of style that truly set her apart from the rest of the women at court. She wore beautiful dresses made of expensive materials like velvet and silk, and she always accessorized with elegant jewelry. But it was her hairstyle that truly stood out. Diane popularized the use of the farthingale, a type of stiff petticoat that created a bell-like shape around the wearer's legs. She also wore elaborate wigs that were often adorned with feathers or jewels. In fact, she was so influential in the world of fashion that many women tried to copy her style. What really worked in Diane's favor was that she had something the king and his wife didn't share: a genuine interest in art and culture. Henry was a big fan of art and literature, and Diane was happy to indulge him. They spent hours together discussing their favorite artists and writers, and they even traveled to Italy together to visit some of the great works of art. They also shared a passion for hunting, and they would spend days in the forest together, away from the prying eyes of the courtiers. Diane was a skilled horsewoman, and she loved to ride alongside the king. And there were even rumors that they engaged in some pretty steamy activities during their hunting trips. But the king wasn't the only man in Diane's life. She had a son named Louis from her previous relationship, and she was determined to make sure that he had a bright future. She sent him to live with his father, the Duke of Étampes, so that he could receive the best education possible. But she never forgot about him, and she made sure that he was always by her side whenever she entered the royal court. It was a brilliant move, because the kid basically had a front row seat to the inner workings of the kingdom, and that kind of knowledge can be invaluable. As Diane's influence over the king grew, so did her power. She was now one of the most powerful women in the kingdom, and she used her influence to help those she cared about. For example, she helped to secure a noble title for her son, Louis, and she also used her influence to help advance the careers of those in the arts and literature. She was a patron of the arts, and she hosted salons where the leading writers and thinkers of the day gathered to discuss their work. In fact, she was so influential in the world of arts that she helped to make French Renaissance a prominent force in Europe. While Diane was able to build up a lot of good relationships, it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. Some people at court hated her guts, probably because of how she openly flaunted her relationship with the king. Right, but she wasn't afraid to stand up for herself, and she was quick to defend herself against her enemy. She was also fiercely loyal to those she cared about, and she would not hesitate to retaliate against anyone who tried to hurt them. Her biggest enemy at court was none other than the Queen, Isabella. From the moment Diane entered the picture, the two women were at each other's throats. But it wasn't just jealousy that fueled Isabella's hatred. Diane was everything that Isabella was not: confident, intelligent, and popular. Diane knew how to handle herself, and she was not afraid to speak her mind, something that Isabella could never do. This just added fuel to the fire, and the two women became sworn enemies. The situation became so bad that Diane was forced to flee the court for a while. But she eventually came back, and things didn't change much. The rivalry between these two women was legendary, and people would place bets on who would come out on top. But Diane didn't just want to win the battle. She wanted to win the war. Ooh. And she had a secret weapon: her son, Louis. He was the spitting image of the king, and it was unlong before Henry started taking notice of him. In fact, the king loved Louis so much that he even considered making him the heir to the throne. This, of course, did not sit well with Isabella, who was desperate to secure her son's position as the next in line to the throne. Bad, but Diane was not afraid to stand up to her, and she knew that she had the king on her side. To make matters worse for the queen, Diane was always in the king's face, literally. Whenever the king went into battle, Diane was right there with him, cheering him on from the sidelines. She was known to kiss Henry on the lips before he went into a jousting match. And let's just say that this did not go over well with the queen. I mean, how could it? Diane was basically rubbing their relationship in Isabella's face at every opportunity. It was too much for the poor queen to handle. Diane's influence over the king was so strong that she was even allowed to participate in important royal ceremonies, like the christening of the king's first child with Isabella. Talk about awkward. And if that wasn't enough, Diane was even given a seat in the royal carriage with the king and the queen, further cementing her place in the royal family. The queen must have felt so humiliated sitting in the same carriage as her own husband's mistress. Even after the birth of the royal baby, Diane was still the king's favorite. She was the one who was invited to all the fancy parties, and she was the one who was always by the king's side. Meanwhile, the queen was left in the shadows, fuming with jealousy. Things got so bad that the queen fell ill, and it was clear that all the stress and jealousy was taking a toll on her health. And who was by the king's side when he visited the sickbed? You guessed it, Diane. While the queen was dying, Diane was the one who received the king's love and affection. If that wasn't enough, Diane's son, Louis, was the one who ended up becoming the next king after Henry died in a jousting accident. So basically, Diane won the ultimate prize, the throne. The irony of it all. She went from being just a mistress to being the mother of the king. Now that's a promotion. So, what happened to Diane after her son took the throne? Well, she continued to be a powerful force in the kingdom. But she also faced some challenges. Her son, King Louis, was not the same as his father, and he was not as fond of Diane as Henry had been. In fact, he was a bit of a control freak, and he didn't like sharing power with anyone, petitioning Diane's reputation as a scheming and manipulative woman had preceded her, and many people in the kingdom saw her as a threat. Despite these challenges, Diane managed to hold on to her power for several years, but eventually she was forced to flee the kingdom. She spent her last years in exile, but she never forgot about the kingdom she had once ruled with an iron fist. In fact, she is still remembered as one of the most powerful and influential women in French history. And if you think that's impressive, wait till you hear about Catherine de Medici. See you tomorrow.